Welcome to the latest episode of the Never Board of Trade podcast, brought to you by the Brampton Board of Trade and the Brampton Honey Badgers. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Jaipaul Massey-Singh.
I'm Vijai Kumar Singh.
And we are here on behalf of the Brampton Board of Trade to talk about what's up in Brampton.
Yeah.
And this week it feels like there's only one thing that's really going on.
Yes.
To the extent that I actually feel pressure right now to make sure we're talking about other stuff on our socials and other channels because but at this particular moment, I think there's really one story that we need to talk about, and that's what's happening at Stellantis.
Are people texting you like a family member passed, or?
They're not quite there, but there have been a lot of those sort of meaningful looks when people see you and they shake your hand they just assume you're going through it.
Yeah.
I was at a conference yesterday. You were at the same one for a little bit, and that was really when the news was breaking and people could see. I was the MC for the event, and every panel I was running out to the lobby to take some kind of phone call or work on something related to this. And I think everyone sort of picked up on the all-consuming nature of Stellantis to Brampton businesses and the Board of Trade yesterday for sure. And as a result, a lot of sympathetic glances and handshakes and hugs. Yeah, 100%. 100%. How about you? You've been hearing about it from people as well?
Yeah, I mean, I've been getting text messages and emails from folks just expressing their sorrow about the situation. We even have a client of ours, or not a client, rather, sorry, a vendor of ours, reach out and say, we're willing to push back our engagement, because we know you got a lot going on and you got to figure things out. And
is that in a Board of Trade context or your Moksha context?
No, in Board of Trade context.
Okay.
Essentially, our BCI is going out a few days later.
Oh, I didn't realize that. I hadn't realized. Okay, well, good on them. I appreciate that that level of awareness. And that's actually an interesting one because the folks from the BCI are based out in the Maritimes.
Yeah, that's right.
And I did have some interactions with folks that are based out west, out in Alberta this morning. And this story, sometimes you don't know because the algorithm of your phone feeds you stuff. Yeah. So things feel like they're big and important, but you realize sometimes it's maybe just the local algorithm is overfeeding me Brampton stories. Yeah. But this has clearly become a national story.
Oh, for sure.
Because I have been getting outreach from folks out west. You got outreach from our vendor out in they're Newfoundland, right?
Nova Scotia.
So this is a story that's definitely traveled.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I think that's why it merits some talking about today, because I think it's not just a Brampton story.
Yeah.
And we'll get to some of the bigger ramifications after we sort of dissect some of the local ones.
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of folks who are paying attention to this.
Yeah.
Because it may mean some things, or trying to figure out what it may mean.
Yeah.
For their particular province or their particular sector, beyond it just being a Brampton automotive story.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I've been listening to the news all day yesterday and today just to learn about the topic and to see what people are saying. Our mayor, for example, and the federal government, which we'll get into. But there are a lot of perspectives on this, a lot of angles that we can tackle. So I think if you're open to it, let's just talk about this.
Sure. So maybe we'll start by just kind of getting out on the table first everything we know about the story, and just so we kind of have a level set for what the information is at this moment. Yeah. And I think it's worth mentioning today is Thursday the 16th.
That's right.
Took me a second. Yeah. And I'm sure that we don't usually plug the date, but because the story is changing, and I think will continue to change in the days to come, there may be new information by the time people are listening to this. So as of this moment, we'll share our opinions right now.
Sure,
does that sound good?
Yeah.
All right. So maybe as a starting point, I'll lay out kind of what we know is going on. So Stellantis operates a vehicle assembly plant here in Brampton, Ontario. And they've had that plant, I believe, since the early 80s, if I recall. Precedes me being in Brampton, precedes you being born in Brampton. But it's in the early 80s, I believe. And for years, we're producing the muscle cars that Chrysler is known for. So the Challenger and the Charger. If you bought any of those, not just in Brampton, although there are many on our streets because it's a local vehicle, but anywhere in North America, that vehicle was produced in Brampton. In December of 2023, the last, and before that they were producing the 300, which was another so highly successful vehicles, and in the case of the 300, flagship vehicles for Chrysler were being produced here in Brampton. And there were reasons for that, including capability and know-how and quality of work, but also things like the Canadian dollar being great for auto manufacturers. And I think it's worth noting that for many automotive vehicles that are produced in Canada, often it's those vehicles that are entry-level vehicles or vehicles that don't have high margin that are produced in Canada because those American manufacturers take advantage of our dollar to make those profitable vehicles. It's why Honda makes the CR-V, which I drive, and that's some of those are made here in Canada. Many of the Ford fleets, it's the entry-level minivans and so forth, were made in Canada. That's starting to change. GM is producing some of the Super Duty pickups out in Oshawa, and we understand that's what's going to be happening for Ford and Oakville ultimately as well, which are high margin, big vehicles. But for the most part, it's vehicles like that that Chrysler was producing, which are mass movers, super popular vehicles, low margin, but they knew it could move a ton of them. They produced those in Canada, and Brampton was the home for some really successful vehicles for Chrysler for a number of years. In December 2023, they ceased production. The last of the Challenger rolled off the line. I think we've all seen the picture of that red Challenger being the last one rolling off. And at that time, they had shared that they were pausing production at that facility for the purpose of retooling it to produce the Jeep Compass. And they were producing two versions of the Compass, the standard combustion engine one, but most specifically, hence the retooling in a big way, was going to be the electric drivetrain Jeep Compass was going to be produced here in Brampton, which resulted, therefore, in the majority of the 3,000 employees that worked at Chrysler, at Stellantis, at that now called Stellantis, being furloughed. And so I think one of the things in this story is, we're talking about those individuals who are going to be impacted by this news, and I'll get to the details in a moment. The reality is many of those people had already been affected in some way. This is really just finalizing their fate in some ways, because many of those individuals were laid off at that time with the understanding they'd be brought back. And the way that that works is that that plant is a unionized plant. Unifor is the union there. And as individuals are sent home because there isn't work for them, they're brought back again. They're put on I think the term is just, it's a wait list. I think there's another term that they use, but let's call it a wait list for now. And based on their seniority, they may be called back to work as the production begins again. A small number of skilled trades were kept at the plant because those were the individuals who were tasked with maintaining and making the changes to the line in anticipation of the new Compass that was coming. So a small percentage of the workforce was retained. The majority of folks were laid off. With the understanding that they were going to come back.
So
pause forward. So please
there for a moment.
Interrupt me over and over.
So December 2023, the last Challengers is made. Now at that point, there's an announcement that the plant will be retooled for the purposes of the electric vehicle production.
That's correct.
Was there a timeline?
Thank you. Yeah, super important. So our understanding was that timeline, and correct me if I'm misremembering, was going to be about a year. But that in late 2024, and then it slowly shifted to early 2025, that we could expect that the Stellantis plant would be back at production. And my recollection of it was in late 2024, they'd be in the testing phase, so they'd start to bring employees back. And then by spring of 2025, it would be in full production. They'd have full employment back at the facility. Needless to say, that didn't come to pass. And we've had conversations with Stellantis rather, and we had conversations, excuse me, with Unifor. And in all cases, we heard that there was an ongoing commitment to making this happen. However, work was proceeding more slowly, that there were other challenges logistically, supply chain oriented, that were causing this to be dragged out, but that Stellantis was still committed to the Compass. So that was sort of where we're at. So timelines are important. And we thought about a year ago that they'd start to be ramping up. Needless to say, didn't happen.
And then just a few months ago, there was this announcement around pausing the retooling.
That's correct. And what they cited there was a couple of factors. One was the economic landscape in general, driven in part by tariffs, and the uncertainty that they were causing as it pertained to the automotive industry across Ontario. And I say Canada, but really Ontario. Automotive is an Ontario industry. But what was also cited along the way was there's been changes with the administration in the US, as well as in Canada, around the commitment to electric vehicles in general as well. Right? Much of the projections that these auto manufacturers are utilizing to justify their investments in that sector has been driven by the understanding that by 2035, depending on your state or country, but in fairness, I think almost every jurisdiction by 2035 was committed to the majority, if not fully, producing electric vehicles. Ontario and Canada being among those jurisdictions. So in a short order, there'd be great demand. And in fact, we know the province in Ontario has made significant investments in helping facilitate the supply chain that was going to allow that to happen, including major investments in Stellantis to help build up a battery plant in Windsor that was going to produce the batteries that in turn were going to be used in the Jeep Compass here in Brampton.
Mm-hmm.
So not only was it this plant, but there was a whole system being set up, and that was not uncommon. Ford is doing likewise, a battery plant in Windsor that's going to support production in Oakville, for instance.
So all in all, we can say that the big bet that Ontario was making, and buttressed, of course, by the federal government, is that our industrial policy for the next at least 10 years, but likely more, is in electric vehicle manufacturing. And
yes, and I would go even further than industrial policy. I think we're seeing it in many of the other policies, particularly in Ontario, that are being made around infrastructure, job training, and other things which were adjacent to direct economic policy.
Yeah.
The whole Ring of Fire approach, the ability to access critical minerals in the north of Ontario, and therefore building up the highways, how we're negotiating with communities, including First Nations and Indigenous communities, to access those resources, was built on this whole notion that we are going to mine in Ontario the critical minerals that are required to produce the batteries that were going to be produced in places like Windsor and in Woodstock. That in turn we're going to drive the automotive industry in places like Toronto, Alliston, Brampton, and Cambridge.
An end-to-end supply chain in Ontario.
Closed within Ontario. So big investments, not just in direct, but in many indirect ways too, that had big and quite frankly had spillover in other ways. We had, for instance, when we had the premiere in Brampton some months ago. It was at that time, and it was part of the conversation we had with the ministers who did the roundtable with us, was some of the changes that are being made, like Bill C-5, to facilitate faster infrastructure development and removing such elements such as community consultation were put in place and passed in part because they were citing the need to accelerate projects associated with Ring of Fire to drive some of this battery development and so forth. So
that's right.
Big ramifications to our commitment to the electric vehicle industry, not just in the production of vehicles, but in a whole bunch of other ways in terms of stakeholder engagement, how communities are going to be impacted, who has rights to some of these resources and so forth.
Yeah. All right. So so you mentioned C5. There's also this 2035 mandate, kind of grandfathered in from the Trudeau era.
That's right.
Around ceasing combustion engines
and moving to electric vehicles. That's
right.
Correct.
Yes.
So we've softened that approach.
Yeah, we have. We paused that. I believe
that's correct, and they have as well in the U.S. Right.
Yeah.
It's worth noting that those batteries that are being produced in Windsor, for instance, although they were in part to support assembly plants like the one in Brampton, were also being shipped across the continent.
Yeah.
So those battery plants are being impacted not just by regulatory and legislative decisions around electric vehicles in Canada, but also by those in the U.S.
Yeah. Okay, so
you have a softening electric vehicle market from the demand side, from the supply side rather, and therefore perhaps not as much need to create as sufficient supply.
Yeah. So fast forward, Stellantis makes this announcement. From your perspective, does this come as a surprise? Is this what's your opinion on this?
I think the general so let's bring everyone up to speed. So this week then, Stellantis made the announcement that the pause is now much more than a pause, and instead of producing the Compass in Brampton, that vehicle production is going to be shifted to Illinois. And my understanding is the plant that's being shifted to had excess capacity. So not building a new facility, they had a facility in Illinois that was being underutilized. And they're now going to retool that facility to produce the Compass instead. And so all the work that would have been done in Brampton is no longer going to be happening here. And as a result, those 3,000 employees that are furloughed are not going to have any foreseeable time that they're going to be asked to come back to work. And at this particular time, Stellantis has no plans in place for that facility. It's also worth noting, as you already talked about, that government incentive and support is driving some of the demand for electric vehicles and some of the wraparound supports. There's also dollars committed from both the federal and provincial level directly into those facilities as well. In the case of the federal government, $13 billion was committed to support the vehicle production in both Windsor and Brampton. In the case of the Ontario government, I believe it was closer to $500 million. But the provincial government has indicated, the premier has indicated, none of those dollars have yet been transferred. They were commitments,
that's right,
but they were never actually transferred yet. But it's worth noting that our taxpayer dollars have gone into supporting this facility that is now being closed down as well.
Yeah.
So where we find ourselves this week now is this important employer in Brampton, not just for the thousands of employees that we've cited who work at the plant, but the many businesses that wrap around Stellantis in the form of people who are producing parts, people who are supporting the maintenance and ongoing running of that equipment, the people who make the uniforms, that those employees wear, the trucking and logistics companies that are bringing parts in and vehicles out.
Freight's a huge one for sure.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the big players in Brampton and the big infrastructure components in Brampton. It's worth noting that there's a giant CN intermodal hub here in Brampton, and many of those vehicles were leaving on train cars that are coming in and out of Brampton. So if Stellantis shuts down, it has these other ripples.
For sure.
Now it's worth noting, as we shared, the plant has been in this shutdown mode for some time. So not every company is going to feel it already. They may have already been feeling it for a year, and we know many have been.
Yes.
So this is not new news, but for many companies, they were still relying on the prospect of Stellantis bringing these jobs back. And so, this is not a new impact directly to some of those companies. They've already been living it for some time, but there was always an understanding that business would return.
Yes.
What they were told, earlier this week was that business is not going to return.
Yeah. And
I think that was really the shocking moment for a lot of folks. Yeah. And by the sounds of it, we do our best to connect with folks in decision-making positions. We have relationships at the provincial government, obviously, municipally. We have some contact with Stellantis through their government relations people, but we're not always in the loop on these detailed conversations. So I wasn't surprised that we didn't hear about it right away. What I was shocked to hear was clearly folks at the province and folks at City Hall had no idea this news was coming either until basically it was happening. And I think we saw that reflected in the statements that were coming out by the premier, by the mayor, by the prime minister that expressed not just disappointment, but really, quite frankly, there was an undertone of you didn't give us any warning here, and really felt they were blindsided by this news. And I think that was an interesting part. This was like a thieves in the night here in a big way.
Yeah.
So what have I not shared? I feel like I'm missing pieces here.
No, I think you covered it. I think you provided good context. What I'm interested in is this truly a tariff-related situation? And I think part of it is because what you've described is a company that has really been in a pause for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
And maybe there was some uncertainty about how this facility could be retooled. And there's also uncertainty about the local demand for these vehicles.
Yeah.
It seems that, with this mandate and a few other things, that there is a manufactured demand driven in part by the government for electric vehicles. But I don't know if Canada is necessarily the market for that.
Sure.
And so I wonder, did the tariff campaign by the Trump administration, was that a convenient cover for perhaps a decision that was maybe they're kicking it down the road a little bit, hoping that maybe there might have been some other circumstance that would have arose?
I think a little bit of both. Now, as it pertains to the demand piece, I think it's worth noting, much like the Challenger, Charger, and the 300, these vehicles would have been for the entire North American market.
Yes.
So even if there was a softening in Canada, that may not have been enough to justify that decision.
But plus the U.S., as you mentioned.
So I think it's a combination of the two. That vehicle, I would argue, I'm not a huge car guy, but from what I understand of that market, I think there would have been demand for that vehicle.
Yeah.
We look at what's on the roads right now. You drive, I drive. We see. What do you see everywhere you go? Small entry-level SUVs.
Yes.
I drive a CR-V.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's that vehicle exists everywhere. Whether it be every manufacturer has one. Jeep does not.
Yeah.
And that Compass was meant to be that vehicle.
That's fair. Yeah.
So I think there was a real market fit for that vehicle, the electric piece aside.
Yeah.
So I don't know that a softening of demand for the vehicle, because if there were, I don't know that Stellantis would have committed to moving that production of that vehicle to Illinois.
Yeah.
Right? They would have just said, we're stopping the Compass program.
That's fair.
So I think there's something to the softening for electric, but they're certainly committed to the platform, and I think there's demand for the platform.
Yeah.
But the conversation about tariffs, I think that's a really interesting one.
Yeah.
And although Stellantis has cited tariffs as being the reason for this move, I think it's important to start that story back in December 2023 for one very, very critical fact, and that is they stopped production and started slow rolling production well before tariffs were ever announced.
Yes.
And that's why I think it's important to have that conversation. And that's why I was so appreciative of you saying, what was the timeline, which I had forgotten to mention. Because production was supposed to have started, quite frankly, before Trump's inauguration.
Exactly.
So in as much as it's convenient to say tariffs are the reason, and I agree tariffs are a factor, it's worth reminding everybody that until the agreement changes, and it's about to be renegotiated, and I don't anticipate massive changes, much of vehicle production and parts manufacturing are covered under CUSMA.
That's right. Yeah.
This is largely a tariff-protected industry for the most part. There are tariffs, not without, but this is not like steel or softwood lumber.
Yeah.
Much of this industry is protected from tariff.
Yeah.
And this process by Stellantis and their action to not commit to Brampton in a fulsome way started before Trump was in power.
That's right.
So tariffs is a part, but I think this has a lot more to do with other factors, including Canadian competitiveness in general.
In general, yeah.
Are we the easiest country to do business in? When we talk to our business members, particularly in the manufacturing sector, they always cite back to us, there's too much red tape. It's too slow to get things done. Despite our labor maybe being less expensive than that in the US, almost everything else is more expensive, including raw material and just all the taxation and regulatory burden that those companies face. The cost of electricity, all these other pieces are part of the puzzle. And I think those are the pieces on the ledger that a company like Stellantis was looking at, much more so than tariff. I think tariff was either I'm speculating here, was either the final piece of that equation or perhaps just a convenient opportunity with some political cover to cite something. And I'm increasingly feeling like that's how I look at tariffs. Yeah. For companies who are looking for a reason to make a shift, not necessarily reshoring from Canada to the US, any kind of business decision right now, you can just say tariff. And people just kind of shrug and go along with it and say, must be. And similarly for our politicians, with all due respect to those who are doing good work, to say tariff, I think, is an easy out to ignore, in some cases, depending on your sector, decades of bad policy that cut across multiple government administrations to say, it's tariffs, what can we do? I think we can do a lot, but it's hard work that calls for some difficult decision making. And it's easier just to say, the angry man in the White House is the reason that we're all, facing these challenges.
And this is where I was getting at a little bit too, and I find fascinating about this situation. These vehicles are CUSMA compliant. They are exempt from these punishing tariffs.
That's right.
And so to use tariffs as an excuse, I think is a bit odd, especially because the plant exists here and it was already supposedly in the process of being retooled.
Yeah.
It's not like even citing regulatory uncertainty or economic uncertainty seems kind of odd because the real estate already exists.
Yeah.
There must be some other explanation.
Yeah. The costs have been sunk.
Yeah, exactly. It's a sunk cost.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, especially because similarly, so before this news about Stellantis came about, there was some debate around autos in the prairies, and specifically, China has mentioned that they would remove punishing tariffs on canola if Canada were to remove the 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs.
That's right.
And this is interesting to me because Wab Kinew from Manitoba, a few others, they've expressed an interest to investigate that.
Yeah.
Doug Ford responded saying, "Hell no."
Yeah.
And And I think we talked about this. You said the Confederation is sort of like showing some cracks. But it is interesting because our decision to apply the tariffs on Chinese EVs was done in lockstep with the United States.
That's right.
There's been a lot of retroactive explanation.
Yeah.
But if we're being intellectually honest, it's because the U.S. did the same thing.
Absolutely.
And I wonder if we're sort of at an interesting philosophical juncture where I think we either have to kind of double down on trying to repair the U.S. relationship, or do we actually seriously entertain going to other partners? And in this context, it would be China.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I don't know either. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff here, and I think it's indicative of where these trade conversations, where we find ourselves in these trade conversations. They are increasingly, we've always seen them as political conversations in the U.S. This was not driven by sound economic policy. This was driven by political whims, the desire to show wins for particular states or whatever the case may be in particular sectors, and really create a nationalism approach. And it's funny, in as much as Canada, we've been trying to deal with this like it's economic policy, whereas in the U.S. it's clearly not.
No,
it's starting to shift. It's becoming a political conversation now in Canada.
Yeah,
you made the joke of the cracks in the Confederacy, but I mean this is really what it is now, right?
Yeah.
We've got Ontario pitted against the prairies because that opening up to that market would benefit absolutely those canola farmers, but would come at the expense of potentially, in the short term at the very least, manufacturing jobs in Ontario.
Yeah.
I think it's dangerous to look at these things as binary.
Yeah.
I might be optimistic or naive, but I think, again, to use your term, intellectual honesty, why would we not at least explore what this means?
Yes.
Now,
especially because we do business with China already on other things.
And again, I'm not an expert in this area, but if we've built out the infrastructure to support battery production and the mining of critical minerals, does that mean there's still a place for us to play in a supply chain that opens up some of this market to China?
Yeah.
Is there a way to do this where it's toggled in such a way? I think the impression people get when we're going to open up the market to China feels like there's suddenly going to be a flood of Chinese. And to be clear, again, not a car guy. Everything I understand about these Chinese electric vehicles, apparently they're
incredible.
They're amazing.
Yeah.
in Europe and in other parts of the world, in Asia, in the Middle East, people are driving Chinese electric vehicles that have amazing range. They're cost effective, and they're reliable vehicles.
Yeah.
So there's a reason why these vehicles are of desire.
Yeah.
They're not here because they're not good. They're not here because we made the policy to prevent them from being in Canada.
Yes.
But is there a way to bring them in a measured fashion? Is there a way to work with particular manufacturers?
Yeah.
Is there a way to support pieces of the infrastructure and supply chain that still allow Canada to participate? I have to believe that there are ways to open up this market a little bit, to allow other vehicles to come in, to potentially create, if we do it in a measured way, with thoughtfulness, that will create jobs in Canada.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, does this put pressure on the U.S. to say, hey, look, I think the one understanding we have, whether you're an economist, work for the Prime Minister's office, or just the average person on the street like you and I, is we do understand the less reliant we are on the U.S. is not just good for our economy because it prevents us from being as impacted by the U.S., but it fundamentally puts pressure back on them. The biggest bargaining chip the U.S. has on us is the fact that we rely on them.
Yes.
So why would we continue to rely on them?
Yeah.
I think even symbolically, to open up our market to other countries lessens the amount of influence that the U.S. has on us. To your point, so much of our economic policy is driven by following them. I think symbolically just saying, look, we're going to do something different is an important step for us to take, just to show that we're capable of making decisions for ourselves.
Yeah.
And I appreciate some of the approaches that Doug Ford has taken during this tariff situation. I appreciate the fact that he wants to be combative.
Yeah.
I agree with him that it's past the point of looking for balancing out, and it's time to look for things that are retributive in nature. I think it's time to start punching back.
Yeah.
I think this is a great way to punch back, and I understand why our premier wants to protect jobs in our province, and I very much want to see that happen. I was at an economic event earlier today with our friends at RBC, and they were sharing the economic outlook for 2026.
Mm-hmm.
And in the main, they see slow growth, but growth for Canada, and have an optimistic view over time for where our economy is going to be. They're saying we're not going to have a recession, but they were very clear to point out That's for the country.
Yes.
Ontario, we're going to go through some pain because of our reliance on the automotive sector,
Yeah.
and other factors, including cuts in temporary foreign workers and other newcomers to Canada.
Cost of housing.
Cost of housing having an outside impact in Ontario.
Yeah.
We are the province that's going to feel it.
Yeah.
And I'm not asking for us to feel it even more, but I just don't see a way out that doesn't look at alternatives like that. And how do you feel? I've talked a lot about this for a topic that you wanted to bring up. My apologies.
No. But to add to that as well, I think it's the oxygen is sort of being. Let me use a different metaphor there. I think a lot of attention has been paid to the auto sector, and I do think steel and aluminum. If we're talking about the context of Brampton, at least, we're far more exposed to trade whims. In those sectors, and there's a great map from the School of Cities. Dr. Tara Vinodrai, who spoke at Brampton in Motion, she was on that project as well, that maps out the entire country and shows different jurisdictions and their level of exposure to various tariffs. And in Brampton, I mean, especially in that southeast corridor, there's a lot of vulnerability to steel and aluminum in particular. But yeah, no. When it comes to China, I think to quote Tom Mulcair, he said it quite poetically. He said, "Do we continue to show our withered hands to the vivisectionist?"
I haven't heard that one in a while. I remember.
Yeah. And I think it's true. At some point, we do have to. We can't replace the U.S. We'll never be able to. But if we want to start sort of slowly decoupling, we do have to look at both the European Union and China.
I think it's really interesting that after a few years, and now an administration change had to happen in Canada to help facilitate that, but after many years now of a frosty relationship that was really around some deep philosophical differences of opinion, we're starting to warm up our diplomatic relationships with India.
Yeah.
And is that driven by a forgive and forget? No, it's driven by a new prime minister, and some of it maybe. Yeah. But I think it's really driven by the fact that fundamentally the issues that face us economically are bigger than the other issues that drove those countries apart. And it doesn't forgive some of the human rights and other issues that these countries have. I'm not saying these are easy decisions to make.
No.
There are real challenges here. And I think some real thought needs to go into our conversations with countries like China about how we manage these relationships in a way that still feels moral and just and ethical.
Yeah.
But to say categorically we're not prepared to work with certain countries, fine. But then we have to be prepared to live with those consequences too. There are no consequence-free decisions here. And I think we're past the point of being able to say we can turn up our nose in conversations with other countries when we're in the situation we have, because this is not a pro-business perspective I'm having here.
Yeah.
This is a quality of life for the average Canadian. Yeah. I'm not here saying we have to morally compromise as Canadians because I want to see more shareholder value for an automotive company that's, by the way, is being propped up by government subsidy.
Yeah.
I'm saying we have to be thoughtful about how we're ensuring that the average Canadian who worked at a plant like that is able to provide for their family when their job is under threat.
Yes.
And so I think it's easy to take grand moral positions, and I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have a moral compass here, but I do think we have to rethink how we're applying that moral compass unilaterally versus how can we continue to still be ethical while ensuring that the average Canadian still has some quality of life, because we are absolutely risking that right now.
Speaking of which, we were at CCC last week, and there was a resolution brought forward by, I believe it was Abbotsford, around not even getting a trade deal, but just further clarity on our trade relationship with China.
Yeah, and it did not go well for Abbotsford.
No, it did not. It did not. Yeah.
CCC being the Canadian Chamber of Commerce conference in AGM, for those who are listening. There,
yes, absolutely. What are your thoughts on this approach that the Prime Minister is taking around identifying specific projects of national interest and therefore expediting the approval processes and the bureaucracy related to those projects alone? I was listening to Kyle Seaback this morning, and he brought up an interesting point. He said, instead of picking winners and losers, why not change the regulatory environment to make Canada more competitive writ large?
Yeah.
And so that the market can pick its own winners and losers. Part of the problem, part of the reason to our earlier conversation, part of the reason why a Stellantis might have chosen to relocate to the U.S. regardless of tariffs is because the cost of doing business in Canada is so exorbitantly high.
Yeah.
Why don't we address that across the board instead of trying to pick these national interest projects? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I can't argue with that approach, because I agree that fundamentally it's a broader competitiveness issue. And I think that's what's driving some of the conversations around initiatives like reducing interprovincial trade barriers. It's a recognition that we're not trying to just get more BC wine, across the country or something like that. It's a recognition that fundamentally it's too hard to do business across our country. So I think taking these sort of omni-channel approaches and saying, like, how do we make better conditions for business as a whole makes sense. So I'm on board with that. I think the one factor, and I didn't hear what Kyle said, so forgive me if I'm misrepresenting his point of view.
Sure.
By the way, Kyle Seebeck and I used to be neighbors at one point.
Oh yeah,
yeah, we lived literally next door to one another.
Yeah.
When I first moved to downtown Brampton.
No way. He's not with Duffer and Callan.
That's right. Yeah, we lost him up to go north, but we both lived on the same street in Brampton for a while.
Yeah, wow.
So I don't want to misrepresent his point of view, but I think where there is some value to the approach that's currently being taken is when we're applying federal dollars and taxpayer monies. So I'm not saying he's wrong. I absolutely agree. The more that we can open up the conditions to allow for businesses to be competitive in the main and allow for the market to pick winners and losers, I'm generally in support of. Until it comes to utilizing taxpayer dollars to fund those projects. At that point, I think there needs to be a deeper criteria that identifies, where is the greatest return on that investment going to happen, and how can those dollars and that development happen in a manner that benefits the most Canadians, not just in financial, but in other ways, quality of life, respecting rights, and including people who might not otherwise have the opportunity to be included in the economy because they might be marginalized for other reasons. So I'm okay with the government picking winners and losers to a degree when it comes to utilizing our money to do so. Again, I don't want to misrepresent.
No, totally. Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. And I think it's interesting, especially because I acknowledge that the cost of doing business in Canada is high, and that makes it very difficult for companies to expand and scale in Canada, and it might be easier to do so in another jurisdiction, and that jurisdiction being the United States. That being said, when conservatives talk about the industrial carbon tax as a barrier for business, and some of the approval processes and duty to consult and all of that, those are important pieces.
Absolutely.
And especially if we start to look at the European Union and doing more business with the EU, we will need these elements in place.
Absolutely.
Because that is it's a non-starter to not have those things. And so I'm almost seeing this emergence of, do we capitulate to the US and just regulatorily harmonize our regulations with the US so that we can do more business with the US? Or do we say, you know what, even though they are geographically very close to us, our values are different, we're more in line with Europe? I don't know. I think that's an interesting debate in my mind.
Yeah. No, I don't disagree, and I think at this point, I don't know that we're even in a position to decide the answer to that question. Quite frankly,
you're right.
Right. And far be it to say you can have your cake and eat it too. But I don't think there's a reason why you can't. I think one of the challenges we have, and I'm not being critical of your point of view. I mean, so it's a broader statement in general. Is that we talk about the economy as the economy. And I think the answer really, as we're sort of seeing right now in your comments earlier about here's how it's looked at in Saskatchewan and Manitoba versus how it's looked in Ontario versus how it's looked in the Maritimes and yada yada. There is a sectoral base and maybe even a regional approach that we need to take. That certain sectors and certain provinces may benefit from having better trade relationships with certain jurisdictions in the EU or in Asia, perhaps out west where trade routes through the Pacific are easier to get to Asia versus in a place like Nova Scotia. But other jurisdictions based on the nature of their economy may benefit from a stronger relationship or a smoother relationship with the U.S. So I think it's a little bit of both, because I think it's actually a more nuanced conversation about where our economy's growth is going to come from and where our opportunities to share Canadian insight, innovation, and productivity may go.
Yeah,
right. So I think it's a little bit of everything.
Yeah, I agree.
There's very few elements of our economy I think are like this is our market is the globe.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other conversation we could have, because I think that we did have those opportunities. I think that's what AI could have been.
Yeah.
But that's a whole other conversation about how bad we are at commercializing R&D in Canada.
Totally.
But when it comes to producing hard goods or utilizing our natural resource capacity to create market, I think it's really about who are we selling to and what are the conditions to optimize for that.
Yeah.
Which is, again, why I think conversations with countries like China need to be on the table, because I don't think it's a binary conversation to say we're now endorsing human rights violations by this government because we're opening up our markets entirely. Yeah. I think there's give and take that can be had here to say, here's what we'd like to see from you, and here's what we're prepared to accept from you in order to facilitate something that's good for both of us. And again, I might be naive, but I think we at least should engage in that in the topic.
For sure. And it can be politically fraught, but we mentioned China and the EU, but we've been talking about a free trade agreement with the Mercosur region, CARICOM. Yeah. You talked about India, improving our trade relationship with India. There are lots of different markets. The African continent, right? There are many markets and opportunities for a bilateral, multilateral relationship that we just haven't pursued because we got used to business as usual with the United States.
I think so, and I do think some of this is a reflection of the cultural shift that's happening within our business community too. And I think there is a little bit of old versus new that's happening in real time right now. Yeah. I think part of our relationship with the U.S. and is for the exact reason you touched on when you're talking about the EU, right? There's a cultural comfort. Yeah. We speak the language, we share values, quote unquote, and proximity matters, of course. Yes. It's way easier to ship something on a truck or a train than on a boat or a plane. But fundamentally, we like working with the U.S. because they feel like us. Yeah. We share TV, we share sports teams, and we all get the same jokes. Yeah. And the class of businesses that comprise the traditional Canadian business sector are of a generation that I think where we were much more a monoculture, and that is changing now. And I think part of it is we have an economic impetus to start exploring relationships with countries that are new markets for us traditionally, like Asia, South America, and parts of Europe, and definitely West Africa. Yeah. But I also believe part of it is now we're better equipped than at any point in our history to do so. Yes. Because the growth of new businesses, the entrepreneur class that's being established in Canada, is largely that it always has been immigrants, but they're immigrants coming from new places now. Okay. It's much easier to establish relationships with a country like India when so many of our new business starts and business owners and business leaders, our political leaders, are of South Asian descent. Yeah. And we're similarly going to see opportunities like that in West Africa. We're certainly seeing it here in Brampton, and with the emerging wave of immigrants that have come to us from places like Ghana and Nigeria, and setting up business and making us more conversant. Oh, for sure. With having trade relationships in West Africa. We're seeing it with the Caribbean, and I suspect that will continue to be the case. So I think part of this reluctance is based on some of the factors we're describing. The comfort, the regulatory space, the alignment of standards. But I think some of it's just this is the natural evolution of Canada's economy. Totally. We've always been immigrants. We're just now immigrants from new places. Yeah. And as we become immigrants from new places, we are going to have opportunities, and we shouldn't stop exploring these opportunities simply because we've never done it before. And it feels a lot to me like there is some othering that's in these conversations that are holding back the productivity of our economy as a result. Totally.
And we've been talking about trade, but I think ensuring that Canada is an attractive place to invest from the rest of the world.
1,000%. We're not even talking about that piece. And that piece is actually suffering right now as well because of the trade relationship. Exactly. Right? Exactly. We're no longer a great place to invest. Quite frankly, the U.S. is about to become an even worse place to invest.
Exactly. No, that's right.
One thing I want to talk about, and I think I know we're coming up on time, but I think I'd love your perspective on this. Yeah. Circling back to Stellantis for a second, if we can. Sure. Is everyone's trying to figure out what to do. And Stellantis has indicated that they've not closed Brampton. They're just trying to figure out what the next step in Brampton is. Yeah. Take that for what it means. Yeah. But in the interim, various levels of government are responding. We put out a response alongside the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. The mayor put out some language that feel very strongly, all talking about the need to see Stellantis come back to the table and honor this commitment to Brampton. Yeah. interesting, and we've seen it at all levels of government, but most interesting to me was the one from the federal level, where they're saying, you got to come back to the table on your commitment to Brampton. And by the way, we gave you a whole bunch of money a couple of years ago because you told us you were going to produce vehicles in Brampton. I think something to the tune of 50,000 vehicles a year.
Yeah.
You have reneged on your commitment, and we are now going to sue you.
Yes. Yeah. Interesting.
Talk to me about that.
Yeah.
What do you think that is? Because I have my thoughts, but I'm curious about your perspective on that.
Well, I think, I don't know to what extent that's a legitimate lawsuit or not.
I don't think it is.
Yeah. I don't know. I think part of it is that it's a signal that the federal government's doing something.
I think so.
That, the Ford government also said none of the money will be transferred unless they kind of recommit to the community. I know Patrick Brown, the Mayor Patrick Brown, is very supportive of any sort of litigation that could potentially follow through. I don't know. I think Stellantis did indicate that they're not shuttering their Brampton plant. They have different plans for it. I guess we'll wait and see what those plans are.
Yeah.
I imagine various governments will try to make it as difficult as possible for Stellantis. I think if the real estate is there, might as well build something. Yeah. So I don't know if all 3,000 of those jobs will be shuttered. They also did indicate that they're adding an additional shift in Windsor, I believe.
It would be a possibilities for 1,500 employees from Brampton to be transferred to Windsor.
Yeah.
How many of those will go?
Yeah.
We don't know.
Yeah.
And the other part that's not really being discussed, and I haven't gotten a clear answer from Unifor yet. I have been doing some outreach to try to understand this.
Yeah.
Is we understand about 3,000 employees were furloughed.
Yeah.
Presumably, some of those employees have found other jobs.
Yeah.
So even if everything were to resume in the short term, which doesn't appear. If Chrysler, or I keep saying Chrysler, if Stellantis brings something to the table, we're probably still a year out because there's going to have to be retooling again to make it happen.
Absolutely.
But presumably not all those individuals are going to be available. So we talk about 3,000 people being affected. Some of those people, if we're being fair, have probably found other work. How many, we don't know.
Yeah.
But to presume 1,500 will just happily move, like Windsor, if you haven't been to drive lately, it's not a daily commute.
No.
So you're asking people to, relocate their families, move, leave whatever they have here in this community behind. They're not all, I can't imagine they're going to find 1,500 people. So there is going to be some impact to Brampton as a result. Because even if you had a job offer in Windsor, you might not be able to take it. But sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But you are right. Yeah, there are some job opportunities to be had in Windsor because of the addition of another shift there. Yeah. That's right.
I just wonder, I don't know if in the fine print of this transfer from the federal government to Stellantis, it included a commitment to keeping jobs within a certain locality. I don't know what example we set by saying, if you make a business decision, we're going to sue you for the money that we gave you. Listen, I would love if there are more jobs in Brampton. I would love Stellantis to get up and running in this community. But I feel like a little bit of this is theater. Yeah. But what are your thoughts on this?
I tend to see it the same way. Yeah. I think the federal government had to say something. Yeah. Ultimately, one of the roles the government has, you are custodians of the taxpayers' dollars. And so to say nothing and acknowledge that dollar amount, I think would have been that would have come back to bite them. Yeah. Someone would have brought up. Pierre Poilievre would have brought it up. Yeah. So they had to say something. Yeah. I do suspect, as you do, this is a little bit of theater. It's showing that the government is trying to act strong and tough here. Yeah. I think whatever negotiation is going to happen behind closed doors would have proceeded the same, regardless of what Minister Joly said. Yeah. But I understand why she had to say it. Yeah. I just curious if you saw it any differently than I did. But I very much see it as feeling like that, because right now, and I feel I'm sympathetic because we feel it a little bit here. I feel it myself. It's a situation in which you don't have a lot of power. Yeah. You feel the impact. Yeah. And you want to show that you're doing something. Yeah. So we put out a press release. We're reaching out to members, trying to understand. One of the things I'm really trying to get a handle on is we talked about some of the upstream and downstream impacts to other businesses. I know the folks at Economic Development at the City of Brampton are similarly trying to do this. We've been in some communication of how can we quantify the true impact of this? Who else can we be trying to help if Stellantis comes back? If Stellantis never comes back, what does that mean for the Brampton business community as a whole? Yeah. So there's work we're trying to do to try to be productive. I'm doing my best to ensure that anyone who's in a decision-making capacity, I've reached out to Minister Fideli's office, I've reached out to Unifor, anyone else who will listen to say, here's what's happening in Brampton so that you have some human faces to this story that I think are important so people understand the real impacts.
Yeah.
But I'm sympathetic to anyone saying, look, this sucks and I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So what can I do that makes it feel like I'm contributing in a positive way? And I believe there's some of that in what happened yesterday from the federal government as well.
Totally.
Let's just show we're doing something.
Absolutely.
But yeah, hopefully Stellantis comes back to the table and there's a good faith conversation on both sides to try to get some kind of production back in Brampton. Because the one thing we didn't talk about, and I think it's important to acknowledge, is this a one-off situation for Brampton? Or is this the first domino, canary in the coal mine, find the analogy you want to use, of a broader exodus or redistribution of capital investment from companies from Canada into the US? Whether they be multinational or even Canadian companies saying, hey, look, we got to establish, because we know for some businesses in Brampton among our membership, they're already pausing some of their investments in Brampton and using those dollars to invest in facilities that they may have in the US because they see, quite frankly, not just the trade relationship because of tariff, but some of the bigger stuff we're talking about. It's just easier to do business there.
Yeah.
And if we're going to make it even 1% harder in Canada, 1% more expensive in Canada, that's enough to tip the scales for a few.
Yeah.
Stellantis is just the most high-profile example of this,
Yeah.
and people are talking about it across the country. But we know there are lots of stories like Stellantis happening at a local level already in Brampton.
For sure.
So I think the big conversation to be had is, and I think the government federally, therefore, is going to be highly motivated to try to find a solution that keeps some jobs. Because I think if one does it, is this just going to be, and there's no repercussion politically, financially, or otherwise, I do think it might make it easier for the next company to do likewise. And I think that might be part of the motivation for Minister Joly as well, is to say, hey, look, we're not going to let you go quietly. We're going to shame you. We're going to try to sue you. We're going to do everything we can just to try to disincentivize companies who might be in similar positions doing similar math to Stellantis to make similar decisions.
Yeah, I genuinely, coming back to the start of this conversation, I genuinely wonder to what extent, the uncertainty about the business landscape in Canada is sort of being obscured by a convenient sort of force majeure circumstance.
Yeah.
As we see with the tariffs.
Yeah.
I think, I don't think this is an example of a successful reshoring strategy from Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I think this is an example of, providing cover for companies that frankly have wanted to divest from Canada. So,
yeah. No, absolutely. And therefore, I think the sooner we can get some resolution to the tariff issue, the better. Not because I believe the tariff issue needs to be solved, but quite frankly, to take it off the table.
Yes.
Because I don't think we're going to have honest conversations in Canada about what needs to be done to solve our challenges around productivity, which we were hearing about well in advance of the Trump administration, to solve our challenges around competitiveness, which we heard well in advance, to hear about the cost of doing business, what we heard well in advance, until we remove this from the table.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate that I don't think our leadership is capable of, walking and chewing bubblegum or whatever analogy you want to use here for saying, like, we need to deal with both at the same time. They seem to want to forget all these systemic issues and focus on this very specific contextual one. So therefore, let's resolve this trade issue, not because I think it's going to solve anything, but because it allows us then finally to have conversations about what the real problems are and hopefully start solving them.
Totally.
Yeah. So,
is that a good place to end?
I think it might be. I don't know how much more we can talk about this today.
Yeah.
I noted down some jumping off points maybe for the next couple of conversations. But no, I appreciate this.
Yeah.
And I guess just stay tuned to our channels because more may be coming in the next few days.
Yeah.
And we'll just continue to keep folks apprised of what's going on here. And maybe when we record the next podcast, hopefully we'll have something more rosy to talk about as it pertains to this topic. But in the meantime, I appreciate you making the time for this.
We'll revisit the Ta-Nehisi Coates conversation.
I still do want to come back to it because I do have notes from our last podcast I do want to revisit.
Sure, yeah.
And the thing that we talked about today that we didn't delve into at all, but I think merits, is that mapping exercise.
Yeah.
Because we've talked about, some of the challenges to making good economic policy locally has been the lack of information about how things break out regionally.
Yeah.
We get lumped in with Toronto in so many other ways, and it makes it so difficult to understand how to advocate for things that matter.
Yeah.
I think this mapping thing that you shared with us is going to be fascinating because it allows us to have real conversations about Brampton and Mississauga and other communities regionally, not just here's what's happening in Toronto in this blanket way.
And you know what? Just for the record, this is a whole topic in and of itself.
Yeah.
This was a challenge doing our transportation white paper. A lot of statistics are aggregated in the Toronto CMA census metropolitan area, and it's hard to get disaggregated Brampton specific data. So I think it's a huge challenge for us as an advocacy institution.
Okay, so I think an upcoming conversation definitely is like that, the pros and cons of proximity to Toronto. Let's talk about that one. Culturally, economically, research-wise. I think that gives us a good podcast that folks like listening to as well.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Okay, so thank you everyone for listening in. Thank you to the Honey Badgers for helping make that happen. Thank you to Josh for putting all this together, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Take care.
All right.